It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and Sarah Williams walked into the downtown branch of Oakwood Bank, her usual calm and confident demeanor betraying none of the excitement she had felt about this moment. She had planned for this day. Sarah, a successful African-American woman in her early 40s, had worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. Today, she was simply here to withdraw a sum of money, something that should have been an easy and routine task for a long-time customer. Little did she know, this seemingly normal transaction would soon expose deep-seated prejudices at the heart of the bank. Sarah had chosen a modest, understated outfit for her visit. A soft gray sweater, dark jeans, and a leather bag that was stylish but not extravagant. Her brown hair was neatly tied in a ponytail, and her makeup was minimal. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be a well-to-do woman, likely in the middle class, someone who belonged. She certainly wasn't someone who should be doubted when it came to financial matters, but that's exactly what happened the moment she approached the counter to make her withdrawal. Behind the counter, Clara Davis, a young woman in her 20s with platinum blonde hair and a bright smile, greeted Sarah. "How can I assist you today?" Clara asked, but her voice lacked the warmth Sarah was used to. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Sarah replied calmly, sliding her ID and the withdrawal slip across the counter. The amount she needed to take out was $75,000, 0 cents, a significant sum, but well within the limits for her account. She didn't expect any trouble. She was, after all, a long-time loyal customer. Clara's eyes widened slightly when she saw the amount. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she quickly recovered. "That's quite a bit," she said, her tone cooler now. Sarah didn't flinch. She'd been through this before, though never quite so openly or so early in her career. She knew that the next steps would be critical, not just for her, but for everyone else who had been treated unfairly, even if they didn't speak up. Clara looked down at her screen for what seemed like an eternity. Then, without offering an explanation, she looked over her shoulder at the senior teller, Martin, who had been working nearby. She whispered something to him just loud enough for Sarah to catch. "Does she look like someone who could afford this much?" The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face. Sarah's stomach churned, but she didn't let it show. She had learned to deal with these microaggressions in her career, the whispers, the sideways glances, the assumption that she didn't belong. She had endured it all for years. But today it was different. This wasn't a random cashier or even a fellow employee. This was her bank, the place she trusted with her finances. These were people who had been paid to serve her, not judge her. The moment Clara turned away to discuss Sarah's transaction with Martin, Sarah's gaze wandered around the lobby. A few customers, mostly white, were already being attended to by the other tellers. They didn't have to wait, didn't have to endure this kind of scrutiny. One of them, a young man in a sharp suit, was escorted straight to a private office with a smile and a handshake. A couple of older women in floral dresses were taken immediately by another employee. Yet here she was, a woman who had built herself up from the ground, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to get to where she was, left standing at the counter with no explanation as to why she was being treated like this. Her mind raced, but she remained composed. Then Martin stepped over to her. "Sorry for the delay," he said, his tone still cool but not outright hostile. He glanced at her withdrawal slip. "You're asking for quite a lot," he added, his words barely concealing a judgment she knew all too well. He continued, his next words coming out much louder than necessary. "We've been having some problems with large transactions lately. I'm going to need to verify a few things." As if it weren't already humiliating enough, Martin's voice raised just enough that the rest of the people in the lobby began to take notice. Heads turned, eyes glanced. She could feel the weight of the whispers, the suspicion in the air. Sarah's mind briefly flashed back to her early career days. She'd started at Oakwood as a lowly assistant, and in the years since she had learned how to handle situations like this. But today this moment was different. She wasn't just a woman asking for her own money. Today she was a woman who had built an empire from nothing, and yet here she was, being treated like she didn't belong. "I'd like to speak with someone who can authorize this." Sarah said, her voice even. She wasn't angry, but she was firm, someone with the authority to handle this transaction. Martin shot a quick look at Clara, who seemed to freeze up at the suggestion. The tension in the room was palpable now. A few customers were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed to take pleasure in it. Clara returned to the counter after speaking with a colleague, and in a tone that was almost mocking, she said, "We're going to need to run some additional checks on your account. Just a precautionary measure, you understand, right?" At this point, Sarah felt her patience start to wear thin. She had played by the rules. She had been a model customer for years. And yet, none of that mattered when it came to the color of her skin. It wasn't just about a financial transaction. It was about her worth. It was about the assumption that she was unworthy, that someone who looked like her could never have earned the right to a sum of money like that. "I understand your protocols," Sarah said, her voice steady, "but I've been a customer for years. I'd like to complete my transaction, please." There was no hint of anger in her voice, just a calm demand for respect. Clara hesitated before returning to her manager. Sarah knew this would get worse before it got better. She could feel it in the air, the quiet but growing sense that the situation wasn't going to be resolved easily. As the minutes passed, Sarah stood her ground, waiting to see just how far the employees would take this before realizing the mistake they were making. She had learned a long time ago that sometimes the best thing to do was wait. As Sarah stood there, unwavering and calm, she couldn't help but think about the long road that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman with big dreams in a small town to the CEO of one of the largest financial institutions in the city, Sarah had worked tirelessly to prove herself. But as she waited in this bank lobby, she realized that none of that hard work seemed to matter to these employees. They didn't see the countless nights she'd stayed up studying, the relentless drive that had pushed her through each role, or the sacrifices she'd made to get here. No, all they saw was the color of her skin. 20 years ago, Sarah had started her career in the very same bank, though it had been a different branch and a different time. Back then, she was just another trainee, learning the ropes, trying to make a name for herself. She was determined to show that a young woman from a modest background could make it to the top. And make it to the top she did. But now, standing at this counter, all of her accomplishments felt irrelevant in the face of what she was experiencing. The staff around her continued to murmur, unaware that the woman they were so condescendingly eyeing was, in fact, their boss. Sarah had made it clear from the very start that she would lead this company with integrity and respect. Her leadership style had earned her admiration from those who mattered. But standing in this bank, she realized how much work still needed to be done. Not just in the bank, but across society. The biases she thought were long gone were still very much alive, lurking behind polite smiles and condescending comments. As Sarah waited for Martin and Clara to finish discussing her transaction, she kept her composure. But internally, her frustration was growing. She had come into the branch expecting a simple withdrawal. Instead, she was being treated like a criminal. And it wasn't just the questioning or the extra scrutiny. It was the underlying assumption that, as a black woman, she couldn't possibly be entitled to such a large sum of money. To these employees, the idea that she had earned her wealth through hard work, intelligence, and sheer determination seemed absurd. The thought of it stung. Every milestone, every promotion, every late night she had spent in meetings or working on reports felt insignificant to them. All that mattered to these employees was their own prejudice. It wasn't just about the transaction anymore. It was about the way they saw her, the way they assumed her place in the world. Then, just as Sarah was beginning to lose hope in humanity, a familiar figure entered her mind: Diane Porter. Diane was not only Sarah's right-hand woman, but she was also a mentor, someone who had guided her throughout her journey in corporate America. Diane had been there for her through thick and thin, providing unwavering support when things seemed impossible. Sarah thought about Diane's advice: "When they look down on you, rise even higher." The words echoed in her mind. She had risen high, but it still wasn't enough. Even when she reached the top, she was still being judged by others. The thought was almost overwhelming, but Sarah knew she couldn't let this moment defeat her. Not after everything she had worked for. As she continued to observe the staff around her, Sarah noticed the stark differences in how customers were treated. The young white man in the expensive suit was already being escorted to a private office. The elderly couple had been made to wait for far too long, their every move being scrutinized by the tellers. The Hispanic man had been subjected to an interrogation simply to cash a check, while the white woman who arrived after him was greeted with warmth and efficiency. But Sarah had had enough. The pattern of behavior was clear now. It wasn't just about a single mistake or misunderstanding, it was a culture of discrimination, deeply embedded in the institution. She knew she couldn't let this go on any longer. It wasn't just her dignity on the line. It was the dignity of every customer who had walked through those doors, trusting the bank to provide them with the same level of service, regardless of their race or background. With resolve, Sarah turned to Clara and Martin. She was tired of waiting for them to take responsibility for their actions. They had been given the chance to make things right and they had failed. It was time for Sarah to take control of the situation. "I understand your concerns," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "But I've been a customer of this bank for years, and I've always trusted that my transactions would be handled with respect. This isn't about the money, it's about how you treat people." Martin, who had been standing off to the side, shot Sarah a glance that was equal parts disbelief and annoyance. He had clearly expected her to back down, to give up and walk away, as so many others had done before her. But that wasn't Sarah's way. She had learned long ago that silence in the face of injustice only allowed it to persist. At that moment she made a decision. She would not leave until she had spoken to someone who could address the systemic issues that were clearly at play here. She needed to make sure that this behavior was exposed, that the culture of discrimination was brought to light, and that the bank took accountability for its actions. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. "I'd be calling someone who can help," Sarah said calmly, taking out her phone. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making it count. As she dialed the numbers, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over her. She had been here before, facing adversity head-on, pushing back against the forces that tried to hold her down. This time was no different. She wasn't going to let her employees or this bank get away with treating people this way, not on her watch. The phone rang twice before Diane answered. "Diane, I need you here at the downtown branch," Sarah said, her voice even but filled with quiet determination. Little did the staff know, Sarah had just made the call that would change everything. It was no longer just about her withdrawal. This was about something far bigger. It was about taking a stand for what was right, and Sarah Williams wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Sarah remained standing tall at the counter, every word spoken to her now becoming a reflection of the systemic discrimination that had been lurking within the institution. She had been treated like a criminal for wanting to access her own money, and the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. How could the bank's employees, who had been trusted with the financial lives of so many, treat a customer this way, simply because of the color of her skin? She had worked her entire career to get to this point. Every job she had taken on, every challenge she had overcome, was a step toward breaking barriers and proving that a woman of color could lead in the world of finance. But standing here, in front of these people, made her question if it was all worth it. Were the efforts of women like her all in vain, if they were still being judged based on their appearance? As Sarah stood there, her patience was being tested, but more than that, a feeling of determination began to rise within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every individual who had been looked down upon simply because they weren't given the same respect and dignity as others. Her role as CEO meant that she had to hold everyone to a higher standard, not just for herself, but for everyone who walked into this institution. She glanced over at the security cameras, silently reminding herself that everything was being recorded. If this was going to be the moment that changed things, then it needed to be captured for all to see. For once, she wasn't just going to let the situation pass unnoticed. She wasn't going to let this moment slip through her fingers. While she stood, maintaining her composure, she noticed a few more unsettling things. The white businessman who had walked in before her was already in a private meeting room while she had been waiting for nearly 40 minutes with no service. An elderly couple of color had been left waiting in the lobby, their eyes filled with silent frustration. It was clear that the treatment wasn't just about one customer. This was about a pattern, one that had been happening every single day in front of every employee in the branch. The undercurrent of bias was undeniable. Sarah had seen this happen countless times before, and it was heartbreaking to realize that it was happening under her very nose. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp tone of Clara, the teller, who had been speaking with Sarah earlier. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there seems to be an issue with your transaction," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah remained calm, maintaining a professional tone. "What issue?" she asked, her voice steady despite the underlying frustration that was building. Clara hesitated. Sarah could see the discomfort on her face. She wasn't fully on board with the treatment Sarah had received, but she still hadn't done anything to stop it. "I'll need to speak to your manager," Sarah said, her voice firm. She had already had enough of the excuses. This was no longer about her transaction. This was about creating a change within an institution that needed it more than ever. Clara reluctantly turned and summoned the branch manager, Jessica Keller, who approached with the same air of superiority that Sarah had come to expect from the rest of the staff. As Jessica walked over, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. She had seen this kind of behavior before, and it was becoming all too familiar. Jessica stood in front of her with an exaggerated smile, one that didn't quite meet her eyes. "Ma'am, I understand there seems to be some confusion with your withdrawal," Jessica said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Is there anything I can do to help clear this up?" Sarah met her gaze without hesitation. "There is no confusion," Sarah replied coolly. "I am simply trying to access my own money, and I've provided all the required identification. I've been a customer here for years, and I expect the same level of service that any other customer would receive." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Well, $115,000 is a large sum, and we do need to ensure that everything is in order," Jessica said, her tone still dripping with condescension. "There are protocols we need to follow." Sarah was now fully aware of what was happening. This wasn't about protocols. This was about assuming she wasn't deserving of this money, assuming she couldn't possibly have earned it. The mere fact that she was being scrutinized so thoroughly for a routine withdrawal, while others were allowed to proceed without issue, spoke volumes. "This is not about protocols," Sarah said, her voice growing more assertive. "This is about assumptions. You're treating me as if I don't belong here, as if I don't have the right to access my own money, and I'm tired of it." Jessica's face flushed with irritation, but Sarah didn't back down. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew exactly how to navigate them. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the realization that she had the power to change things now, or maybe it was the weight of everything she had fought for finally catching up to her. But she was done letting people walk all over her, done letting these biases go unchecked. "I would like to speak to someone who can actually help me with this transaction," Sarah continued, her words clear and deliberate. "Someone who has the authority to override whatever issue you seem to have." Jessica's eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms. "I'm the branch manager," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "There is no one else." But Sarah wasn't about to let her off that easily. She knew that it was time for things to change, and as she stood there, facing Jessica, Sarah made a decision. It was time for her to take control of the situation. "I'll be calling someone who can help me," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. She was going to put an end to this right here, right now. No more waiting, no more second-guessing. It was time to stand up for what was right. As Sarah dialed the number for her trusted colleague Diane Porter, the head of operations at the bank, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. She wasn't just calling to resolve a personal issue. She was calling to bring attention to a deeper, systemic problem that needed to be addressed. And she wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "Deanna," Sarah said as soon as the phone rang, "I need you at the downtown branch now." The voice on the other end responded immediately, and Sarah could hear the urgency in her tone. "I'm on my way," Diane said. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." This wasn't just a simple withdrawal anymore. This was about exposing the truth, about standing up for what was right. Sarah knew that this moment would change everything. As the tension in the lobby thickened, Sarah stood with unwavering composure, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The employees around her were on edge, exchanging nervous glances. Jessica, the branch manager, had just made an audacious move, and Sarah could feel it. This was no longer a simple customer transaction. This had escalated into a showdown of principle, dignity, and accountability. The eyes of the room were now fixed on Sarah, and she knew that this moment would be pivotal not just for her, but for every individual who had ever been marginalized or mistreated because of who they were. Jessica, still standing across from Sarah, had grown visibly uncomfortable, her earlier confidence now replaced with uncertainty. "Ma'am, I've already explained the situation," Jessica said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm afraid there's not much more we can do." Sarah, however, wasn't buying it. The words were ringing hollow. She wasn't just dealing with a problematic transaction, she was dealing with someone who was undermining her based purely on her appearance and assumptions about her background. This wasn't about security or banking regulations, it was about a blatant display of prejudice. "I'm sorry, but that's not good enough," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "You're assuming things about me that are not only untrue, but also deeply unfair. And you're making this far more difficult than it needs to be. I've been a customer here for years, and I expect the same level of service that any other person would get." Her words carried a power that sent ripples through the room. The tension was so thick that it felt like you could cut it with a knife. For the first time, Jessica hesitated, her mask of authority cracking slightly. Sarah noticed the shift in her demeanor, the way Jessica's posture stiffened, and the way her eyes darted nervously toward the back of the bank. She was realizing the gravity of the situation. Behind Jessica, the staff had gathered like a wall of silent witnesses, watching as the exchange unfolded. There were no more smiles, no more courteous gestures, just a palpable sense of discomfort. A few of the employees glanced at each other, avoiding Sarah's gaze. Richard, the senior teller, had his arms crossed and his posture defensive. Mark, the security guard, was clearly unsure about what role he should play. It was becoming obvious to everyone that Sarah was in control now, and they could no longer pretend that this was just a minor hiccup in the usual customer service process. Just as Sarah was about to address Jessica again, she heard the sharp click of the door opening behind her. The sound cut through the tension like a thunderclap. Diane Porter, the head of operations, walked into the room. Her presence was undeniable. Diane, with her professional demeanor and commanding stride, exuded authority. "Stop this immediately," Diane's voice rang out, and everyone in the room froze. Jessica, who had been ready to respond with another excuse, fell silent. The staff behind her shuffled uneasily, caught between loyalty to their manager and the undeniable reality that they were witnessing a moral and professional failure unfold in real time. Sarah felt a small wave of relief wash over her. She knew that Diane, as the head of operations, was there to back her up. The situation was about to shift dramatically. Diane's presence was not only a signal that someone in a position of real power had arrived, but it also meant that the consequences of the actions that had transpired in this branch were about to be exposed for all to see. Diane walked past Jessica, her gaze cold but focused on Sarah. "Ma'am, I am so sorry that this has happened," Diane said, her voice full of genuine concern. "We are here to make sure this gets resolved." It was a stark contrast to Jessica's earlier behavior, one dripping with condescension and judgment. Diane didn't need to be told who Sarah was. She already knew. She had worked with Sarah for years, watched her climb through the ranks of the company with hard work, determination, and an unshakable commitment to excellence. Diane understood the weight of this moment. She understood that this wasn't just about one woman's bank account. It was about the future of their entire institution. Jessica, however, remained unyielding. "I'm not sure what you mean, Diane," she said, her voice still laced with frustration. "There were concerns about this transaction. I was just doing my job." Diane's eyes narrowed. "No, Jessica, you weren't. What you were doing was treating Sarah with suspicion, disrespect, and prejudice, and that is not the standard we uphold here." Diane turned toward the rest of the employees, her gaze piercing. "This is not about protocols. This is about the very core of who we are as a company." A collective silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Sarah, who had been silently observing, knew that this moment would define the direction the bank would take from here on out. The truth was now inescapable, and it was being broadcast for everyone to see. Diane's voice was steady, but there was an undeniable weight in her words. "We've been reviewing the customer data from this branch, Jessica," she said, her tone unwavering. "What we've seen is deeply troubling. We've seen a pattern of differential treatment based on appearance, socioeconomic status, and race. It's not just a few isolated incidents, it's systemic." Jessica's face went pale, and Sarah could see the first cracks forming in her armor. She had been too comfortable for too long, thinking she was untouchable, thinking she could treat customers however she wanted. But now, the reality was setting in. "The evidence is clear," Diane continued, "and what's happening here today is a clear violation of our company's values and the law. We are holding you accountable for this." The room remained dead silent, every pair of eyes locked on the two women at the center of it all. Sarah, standing tall and composed, was now fully aware of the power of her position. She wasn't just a customer. She was the CEO, and she was determined to make sure the message was loud and clear. No one, no matter who they were, would be allowed to experience the kind of treatment that she had been subjected to today. Jessica's knees buckled as she realized the full extent of her actions. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some filled with silent judgment, others with pity. The shame of what she had done was now fully sinking in. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, but the apology felt hollow. It was too late for apologies. The damage had already been done. Diane turned toward the staff, her expression hardening. "Effective immediately, Jessica, Keller, Richard, and Mark are relieved of their duties. They are terminated from their positions here at Meridian Financial." A collective gasp echoed through the lobby, but Diane wasn't finished. "We will not tolerate this behavior. This institution is built on the values of respect, integrity, and fairness. Any employee who cannot uphold those values will not remain part of this company." As Diane gave the orders, Sarah knew that this moment would be remembered not just by her and the employees involved, but by every customer who had ever walked into this branch. This was a turning point, a moment where the bank took a stand against prejudice and took action to change. The silence that followed was heavy, but Sarah knew it was the silence before the storm of change that was about to sweep through the institution. As the atmosphere in the flagship branch of Meridian Financial began to shift, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve deep within her. The air was thick with anticipation. Staff members stood frozen in place, their eyes wide, processing the consequences of the events that were unfolding. Sarah had stepped into a world where biases and prejudices were no longer going to be swept under the rug. Today wasn't just about one wrong transaction. It was about holding the entire institution accountable for its failings and vowing that this kind of treatment would never happen again. Diane, the head of operations, moved swiftly, her presence commanding attention as she prepared to take full control of the situation. The remaining employees knew that the time for excuses was over. Jessica Keller, who had once confidently paraded her authority across the bank, now stood as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the culture they had allowed to persist. Her career, which had once seemed untouchable, was now in shambles. Richard and Mark, complicit in the discriminatory behavior, were facing the harsh reality of their actions. Sarah watched quietly as Diane addressed the employees. Her voice was calm, yet there was no mistaking the power behind her words. "This branch," she began, her gaze sweeping over the room, "has been built on a foundation of fairness, equity, and trust. But what we saw today, what we experienced today, is a clear betrayal of those values. We cannot and will not stand by while customers are treated like this." The staff who had been a part of the discriminatory behavior were now facing the consequences of their actions. Diane's voice grew firmer with each passing word, her determination clear. "Effective immediately, Jessica, Mark, and Richard are no longer employees of Meridian Financial. Their actions have demonstrated that they do not belong in an institution that upholds integrity and respect." Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. There was no applause, no cheering. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had taken place, something that would change the course of the bank's history forever. This was not just a firing, this was a public dismantling of the culture that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. Sarah, who had once been the subject of bias and judgment, was now standing at the helm of a movement for change within the very institution that had sought to undermine her. As Jessica, Mark, and Richard were escorted out of the building by security, the remaining employees stood in stunned silence. The reality of the moment had set in. This was not just about a few bad apples. It was about an entire system that had failed to provide equal service to every customer, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. The ramifications were undeniable, and they were just beginning. Diane, with the weight of leadership firmly on her shoulders, turned toward the staff and spoke once more. "What happened today is not just about the individuals who have been let go. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. From now on, every employee here will be held accountable for upholding the values we claim to represent." Her voice was unwavering, a declaration that the days of tolerating such behavior were over. The remaining staff exchanged nervous glances. Some appeared relieved, while others were visibly shaken. They had seen the truth, the very thing they had tried to ignore for so long. But the message was clear. There would be no more tolerating injustice, no more excusing behavior that went against the bank's mission of fairness and respect. This was a turning point for Meridian Financial, a moment that would mark the beginning of a new era. An era where accountability and inclusion would be the standard, not the exception. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She stood looking around the room at the people who had witnessed it all. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice strong and full of purpose. "What happened today cannot be undone, but it is within our power to change the future. We will start by holding ourselves accountable. Every branch, every department, every role in this institution will be evaluated not just for profitability, but for fairness." The room was silent as Sarah's words echoed through the lobby. The employees knew that this was more than just a corporate statement. This was a commitment to change. This was the beginning of a new culture at Meridian Financial, one that would prioritize respect, dignity, and equitable service for every customer who walked through the doors. As Sarah finished speaking, she felt a sense of clarity. The weight of leadership wasn't always easy, but in moments like this, it felt necessary. She had fought for this moment not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or disregarded because of their appearance. Today, the bank had seen firsthand what could happen when biases were left unchecked. But more importantly, they had seen what could happen when someone stood up and said, "No more." Sarah's next steps were clear. The bank would undergo a thorough transformation, from updated training programs to new policies. The bank would commit itself to fostering an environment where every customer was treated with dignity, regardless of their background. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. The change Sarah envisioned wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to make it happen. In the weeks and months that followed, the bank began to implement new initiatives designed to root out discrimination at every level. They introduced anti-bias training for every employee, created a new system for reporting discriminatory behavior, and held regular workshops to ensure that their commitment to fairness wasn't just a slogan, but a deeply ingrained part of the company culture. It was a massive undertaking, but Sarah and Diane knew that it was the only way forward. 6 months later, Sarah walked into one of the branches unannounced, dressed in simple, casual attire. This time, her purpose wasn't to expose the flaws in the system. It was to witness the changes that had taken root. As she walked through the lobby, she saw employees interacting with customers in ways that reflected the new culture of fairness and respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The changes were real, and they were beginning to make a difference. Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that while the battle for equality in the workplace wasn't over, the fight had made significant progress. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so had led her company toward a future where respect, fairness, and dignity would be at the heart of everything they did. As the dust settled in the Meridian Financial flagship branch, a deep sense of transformation hung in the air. What had started as a simple act of discrimination had turned into a powerful moment of change, not just for Sarah but for the entire institution. The actions of a few individuals had exposed the deep-rooted biases that had been allowed to persist for too long. However, in that moment of reckoning, the leadership stood firm and accountability was demanded. For Sarah, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, disrespected, or marginalized because of their background. By standing her ground, she had sent a clear message that no one, regardless of their position or status, was beyond accountability. The institution, as well as the employees, learned a powerful lesson in integrity, fairness, and respect. This story teaches us that change begins with action, and that standing up for what is right can create ripples that will echo for years to come. The story serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful or influential someone may seem, everyone must be held to the same standard of respect and dignity. It also highlights that small actions like questioning something that feels wrong or standing up when you see injustice can lead to monumental changes. It is a call to never let discrimination slide and to always be the voice for fairness in any environment. The message from Sarah's story is clear. We all have the power to make a difference, whether in our workplace, our community, or our personal lives. It is our responsibility to ensure that everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. If you've found this story inspiring and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, drop a 1 in the comments. If you think the message could be stronger, press 0, and I'll work to make the content even more compelling. Together, we can continue to spread the message of fairness, equality, and respect in all aspects of our lives. Let's keep this conversation going and work towards a better, more just world for everyone. Thank you for watching.